The snow-covered road stretched endlessly, a white ribbon cutting through the frozen Russian landscape. Hundreds of German soldiers trudged forward, their boots crunching against packed ice, breath steaming in the brutal winter air. They weren't marching anymore. They were stumbling. Heinrich Müller's hands were so frozen they felt like wooden clubs. His rifle hung uselessly at his side, and each step was an act of pure survival. Behind him, the once mighty German Sixth Army was disintegrating, not from enemy fire, but from something far more merciless: starvation, cold, and total defeat. This was the road out of Stalingrad, a road of death. The Battle of Stalingrad would become the single most catastrophic military defeat in German history. What began as Hitler's ambitious push to crush the Soviet Union had transformed into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were now trapped, cut off, and facing certain destruction. Heinrich Müller was one of the few who would survive to tell the story. Born in a small village outside Munich, Müller had been a young Wehrmacht soldier full of patriotic enthusiasm when he arrived in Russia. He believed, like many others, in the promise of a swift victory and a quick return home. The reality would be something entirely different. The first signs of trouble came slowly. Supplies became scarce. Communications broke down. The Soviet forces, instead of collapsing, had surrounded the German positions with remarkable strategic skill. By November 1942, the trap was closing. "We thought we were invincible," Müller would later recall in his memoirs. "The German army had conquered most of Europe. How could we possibly be defeated?" But defeat was coming, and it would be total. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers began dying not from Soviet bullets, but from the unrelenting cold. Frostbite claimed ears and toes. Men huddled together for warmth, burning whatever they could: documents, wooden crates, anything that might generate a spark of heat. Food became a distant memory. Soldiers ate anything they could. Leather boots were boiled and consumed. Horses were killed and eaten raw. The once proud German soldiers were now reduced to desperate, starving animals fighting for basic survival. By December, the situation was catastrophic. The Soviet counteroffensive, led by General Georgy Zhukov, had completely encircled the German forces. No reinforcements would come. No retreat was possible. Over 250,000 German soldiers were trapped in what would become a death zone. Heinrich Müller watched as units disintegrated around him. Discipline collapsed. Officers who had once demanded perfect military order were now just as desperate as their men. The mighty Wehrmacht, which had swept across Europe with seemingly unstoppable force, was being systematically destroyed. Diary entries from survivors paint a horrific picture. Frost-bitten men with blackened limbs, soldiers hallucinating from hunger and cold, the ground littered with frozen corpses. An entire army was being erased, not by heroic combat, but by the brutal indifference of nature and strategic defeat. The German High Command's response was criminal. Hitler demanded no surrender. Fight to the last man were his orders. But these weren't just orders, they were a death sentence. When the all-Soviet offensive came in January 1943, it was swift and brutal. The remaining German forces were overwhelmed. Of the 250,000 soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ultimately return to Germany. Heinrich Müller would be among the rare survivors. His survival was a combination of luck, determination, and a willingness to do anything to stay alive. The road out of Stalingrad was lined with death, frozen bodies, abandoned equipment, broken men who had lost everything: their comrades, their hope, their belief in victory. Müller would later describe it as a slow, agonizing march through hell. By the time he reached German lines months later, he was barely recognizable, skeletal, frostbitten, traumatized, but alive. The Battle of Stalingrad would become a turning point in World War II. The myth of German military invincibility was forever shattered. The Soviet Union had dealt Nazi Germany a blow from which it would never fully recover, and Heinrich Müller, he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how something so catastrophic could have happened. How an entire army could be destroyed not just by enemy action but by the cold, unforgiving mathematics of strategic failure. His story was just beginning. Müller's post-war life was a study in haunted survival. Unlike many of his fellow veterans who tried to bury their memories, he became obsessed with documenting and understanding the catastrophe at Stalingrad. He began collecting testimonies from other survivors, meticulously recording their experiences. Each interview was another fragment in a complex psychological puzzle. Why had they followed Hitler? How had an entire generation been so completely deceived? His research took him across Germany, talking to soldiers who had been there, to families of those who never returned. Some were idle, seeing him as a reminder of their collective shame. Others were desperate to unburden themselves, to ally speak about the horrors they had witnessed. One recurring theme emerged: the total disconnect between the propaganda they had been fed and the brutal reality they experienced. Young men who had been told they were racially superior, destined to conquer vast territories, had instead found themselves reduced to starving, freezing creatures fighting for basic survival. Müller's own psychological scars ran deep. He suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though such terminology didn't exist then. Night terrors plagued him. He would wake up screaming, reliving moments of extreme desperation, the taste of boiled leather, the sound of men freezing to death, less white landscape of the Russian steppes. His wife Gertrude was a saint of patience. She had met him after the war, when he was already a changed man. Where other women might have been repulsed by his haunted demeanor, she saw the wounded humanity beneath his trauma. She understood that his obsessive research was a form of healing, a way of making sense of the incomprehensible. Academic institutions initially viewed Müller with suspicion. A former Wehrmacht officer documenting the failure of the Nazi military machine was an uncomfortable presence. But as years passed, his meticulous research became increasingly valued. He wasn't trying to glorify or excuse us, he was trying to understand. His most significant work focused on the strategic failures that led to Stalingrad. He traced how ideological blindness had replaced rational military planning. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical retreat, his megalomaniacal belief in total victory, had transformed a potentially recoverable situation into a complete disaster. Müller discovered internal Wehrmacht communications that revealed the growing skepticism among senior officers. Many had recognized the strategic impossibility of their position months before the collapse, yet institutional loyalty and fear of Hitler's retribution had prevented meaningful resistance. Through extensive interviews and archival research, he documented how individual soldiers had been transformed from professional military personnel into desperate survivors. The narrative wasn't about heroism or ideological commitment, but about basic human survival under the most extreme conditions imaginable. His work challenged the emerging post-war narratives. He wasn't interested in blame or absolution, but in understanding the complex human mechanisms that could lead an entire society into such catastrophic self-destruction. By the 1960s, Müller had become a respected, if controversial, military historian. His books were required reading in staff colleges across Europe. Young officers studied his forensic analysis of how strategic hubris could lead to total defeat. Yet privately, he remained tormented. Each lecture, each research paper was another attempt to exorcise the ghosts of Stalingrad. The frozen faces of his fallen comrades were always just beneath the surface of his consciousness. His greatest contribution wasn't just historical documentation, but a profound psychological exploration of how ordinary men could become participants in extraordinary horror. He showed that the line between civilization and barbarism was far thinner than most people wanted to acknowledge. In his later years, Müller became increasingly introspective. The academic world respected him, but few truly understood the internal battles he fought daily. Each lecture, each book chapter was a carefully constructed mosaic of memory and analysis. His major work, published in 1972, was a deeply personal exploration of collective trauma. Unlike his previous scholarly texts, this book blended historical analysis with personal reflection. He wrote about the psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary people to become complicit in systemic violence, drawing not just from military archives but from his own profound self-examination. Gertrude remained his anchor. She understood that his research was more than academic pursuit. It was a form of collective healing. When nightmares would wake him, trembling and sweating, she would hold him, whispering reassurances in the darkness of their Munich home. By 1975, Möller had largely withdrawn from public speaking. The energy required to repeatedly confront these painful historical narratives had become too exhausting. His health was declining, a combination of war injuries, psychological stress, and the natural progression of age. In his old years, he focused on mentoring younger historians. He wasn't interested in creating carbon copies of himself, but in cultivating a generation of researchers committed to nuanced, empathetic historical understanding. Several of his students went on to become significant aces in European historical scholarship, carrying forward his commitment to understanding human complexity. On quiet afternoons, Möller would sit in his study, surrounded by meticulously organized files and photographs. Sometimes Gertrude would dip him staring at a particular image. A snapshot from Stalingrad, a map marked with troop movements, a letter from a fallen comrade. He was still processing, still trying to understand. His last manuscript remained unissued. It was a deeply personal account that explored the psychological journey from ideology to survival, from belief to disillusionment. The pages were filled with raw, unfiltered reflections that seemed more like a confession than a historical document. When Möller passed away in 1981, he left behind not just an extensive historical archive, but a profound testament to human resilience. His work challenged simplistic narratives of good and evil, showing instead the intricate psychological landscapes that shape human behavior during extreme circumstances. Gertrude survived him by nearly a decade. She carefully preserved his research, understanding its immense historical significance. Their home became a kind of archive, a sanctuary of memory and careful documentation. The legacy Möller left was not about glorifying or condemning, but about understanding. He had transformed his own traumatic experiences into a rigorous, compassionate exploration of human nature. His work demonstrated that true historical understanding requires more than facts and dates. It demands empathy, nuance, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. In academic circles, Möller became more than a historian. He was seen as a philosopher of human experience, someone who had looked directly into the abyss of human potential for destruction, and emerged not with judgment, but with profound insight. His students and colleagues would often quote his most famous line, "Understanding is not excusing, it is the first step toward preventing." The frozen landscape of Stalingrad, which had once been a scene of unimaginable horror, became through Möller's work a profound lesson in human complexity. No longer just a military defeat, it became a profound exploration of how ideology, fear, and survival intersect. As decades passed, Möller's work continued to influence generations of historians, psychologists, and scholars. His commitment to nuanced, empathetic historical analysis remained a benchmark for serious academic research. Hans Möller had transformed his own trauma into a powerful tool for understanding. His life's work was a testament to the human capacity for reflection, healing, and ultimately, hope. His legacy resonated beyond academic corridors, touching those who sought to understand the deeper psychological dimensions of historical trauma. Universities across Europe began integrating his methodological approaches, teaching students that history is not a collection of distant events but a living, breathing narrative of human experiences. Möller's personal archives were eventually donated to the Berlin Historical Institute, where researchers continued to explore his unissued manuscripts and personal correspondence. Each document revealed another layer of his profound commitment to understanding human complexity. In the decades following his death, international conferences would reference his groundbreaking work, acknowledging how he had transformed historical scholarship from a mere chronological record to a deeply humanistic exploration. His wife Gertrude in her early years would often reflect on how Hans had never viewed himself as a hero but as a witness who chose understanding over condemnation, empathy over judgment. The photographs, letters, and research notes Möller had collected became more than historical artifacts. They were fragments of human stories, each revealing the intricate psychological landscapes that emerged during moments of extreme social and political pressure. As new generations confronted their own complex historical challenges, Merle's work remained a beacon of intellectual and emotional integrity. His approach suggested that true healing comes not from simplistic narratives of blame, but from genuine attempts to comprehend the full spectrum of human motivation. In Hans Merle's life was a testament to the power of reflection, of turning personal pain into a universal understanding that transcended individual experiences. His journey from a young soldier to a compassionate historian demonstrated how personal transformation could become a broader instrument of collective healing. The frozen memories of Stalingrad, the haunting letters, the meticulously documented research, all became a bridge between past suffering and future understanding.